Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. Few issues are so essential to America's sense of itself or so controversial as immigration. The mythology of our open door, a door too often opened only selectively, has drawn criticism from nativists on the right wanting to protect the Western European traditions that founded this country 228 years ago, and for instance from labor unions on the left fearing cheap labor will undercut our own standard of living. The issue is even tearing apart the Sierra Club, as a group of insurgents wants to add limiting immigration to its traditional environmental agenda, on the grounds that unchecked immigration poses a threat to the American way of life. But arguably, and I suspect the panelists who join us tonight would agree, immigration is the American way of life, and in recent years has particularly reinvigorated our city. Whether you view the increasingly complex ethnic, racial, linguistic, and religious mix in New York City as a melting pot, a salad bowl, or a gorgeous mosaic, immigrants, legal and undocumented, now comprise a higher percentage of our city's population than ever before. We are joined by four New Yorkers who think and write about immigration. Peter Kwong heads the Asian American Studies at Hunter College. Joel Magayan-Reyes is the executive director of Asociación Tepeyac, an advocacy group for Mexican immigrants. Siobhan Dennehy is the executive director of the Emerald Isle Immigration Center in Queens, which focuses on assisting Irish immigrants. And Ari Zolberg is the director of the International Center for Migration, Ethnicity, and Citizenship at New School University. Professor Kwong, let me start with you. Asian immigrants in this city traditionally meant Chinese, but that obviously is not the same anymore. We've had a Pan-Asian immigration. We've had Koreans, we've had Indians, Pakistanis, Bengalis, Arabs. We've had Bukharans from Soviet Asia. Are there commonalities in those experiences? Are there differences? How has that changed life in the city?
Well, there are a variety of Asian groups, as you mentioned. But I think two groups much more distinct. One group is Asian from East Asia. The other group is South Asians. So these are the two major component parts. In fact, Pakistanis, Bangladesh, and Indians are almost 50% of all the Asians in New York City. And between Chinese and Koreans, which are two largest East Asian population, there are a lot more commonality. But nevertheless, as new immigrants, we share a lot of the common issues.
Mr. Magayan, the Mexicans are among the fastest growing immigrant group in the city, and a group that's been a mainstay of the underground economy in this city. And now the Bush administration is talking about some form of a guest worker program that would give them some legal protections, while at the same time blocking or throwing up roadblocks in the path of citizenship. Is this, how do people in the Mexican community view that balancing act?
Basically, I think President Bush is trying to get the attention from those who are employers, and they are trying to get more workers. Fortunately, Senator McCain was talking about how the United States need around 10 million more workers in the next 15 years. And I think President Bush is just trying to get more workers for the next years to get the possibility to be the power in the world, also selling the best prices of things from the United States. Unfortunately, I don't think that it's going to be easy to compete against China and Europe countries and other countries that they are just trying to get the best prices in the world. But I think the immigrants in New York City are growing and growing, and they are not getting the attention from President Bush, because he was just talking about immigrants who are going to come, and they need to be legalized as guest workers just for 3 years. And I think immigrants who are in the United States, like we are 11 million workers, new workers who need permanent residency, and they are not getting the attention from President Bush. So he was just sending the message to congressmen and senators to check how we can change the immigration system. And I hope President Bush is going to support one of the two major or main bills at the Congress right now. We have the Senator McCain, who introduced a bill to legalize undocumented immigrants and also those who are coming to the United States. And we have also the Senator Hagel and Daschle, who introduced another bill after President Bush was talking about legalizing undocumented immigrants and legalizing new workers to the United States. And it's another bill which could help the immigrants. You know, in the United States, we have probably 11 million undocumented immigrants, and just in New York City, we have 2 million undocumented immigrants, just in the city of New York. And I talk about the Mexicans, we are around 700,000 Mexicans. Some of them immigrants, most of them immigrants, 90% undocumented immigrants. We have also the children of immigrants who are born here now.
Ms. Dennehy, the Irish have been coming since the 1840s, and in the last 20 years there's been this huge influx. Why is that?
I guess you could say that we're creatures of habit. We certainly started a pattern of coming here after times were very hard in Ireland in the mid-19th century, and it's been very cyclical, a continuous cycle of people coming from Ireland seeking to make and maintain contacts with family, seeking greater opportunity that this country has to offer. And in the past 20 years, I mean, you've seen a very, very radical change in Ireland, certainly in its economy. I'm a product of a very slow economy. I came here in the late 80s where things were very, very, I wouldn't say poor, but there weren't a lot of options for the very young population that was in Ireland at the time. In the late 80s, probably 50% of the population of Ireland was under 25. Had a very good education and was looking to pursue a dream, and as history is written, they came in search of that dream in America. Things have changed substantially in Ireland. We've had an economic boom, fondly called the Celtic Tiger, and the Celtic Tiger at the moment is taking a bit of a rest, and things have eased off slightly, but people are still looking at options, and the fact that Ireland and Europe's borders have somewhat mushed or melted together since the formation of the European community as such. Traditionally, people will look at immigration as an option for themselves, look at an option of exploring the world, look at options of coming to America, maintaining those cultural traditions with family, and you know, I can only mention tomorrow, it being St. Patrick's Day, and you'll see the evidence of that on the streets in Manhattan.
Professor Zolberg, who is an immigrant from Belgium, Sierra the club debate I made reference to in the opening over immigration as a quality of life or an environmental issue. You know, other than the Native Americans who were here when the first Europeans arrived and the first African slaves arrived, we're all immigrants, or children of immigrants, or descendants of immigrants. Are there commonalities in the experience of the Irish and the Chinese and the Mexicans that kind of should inform the debate over immigration?
Let me just start by saying I happened to have been in Ireland last year, and of course the most amazing thing is that Ireland is now itself an immigration country. I mean, it really has a very solid flow of immigrants into Ireland, which I think is part of this tiger business that you mentioned. Well, I think that let me start with the Sierra Club itself. This conflict has really been rambling in the Sierra Club now for over 20 years, actually, and it started even before the Sierra Club in the early 80s, about 25 years ago or so, when out west in Colorado and places like that, some of the environmentalists began to pick on immigration as a problem. And it's a mixed bag because some of these are serious environmentalists who see population growth, you know, there are organizations like Zero Population Growth and so on. And it is a fact that most of the population growth of the United States is attributable to immigration,
Especially
rather
in the
than
city.
to,
Especially in the city.
yeah, but overall,
Right.
nationally, the growth of population, more of it is attributable to immigration than to indigenous reproduction. So people who are worried about population growth pick on immigration as a problem. But there's a kind of, that's the sort of clean side of it. The dirty side of it, sort of the underside of it, is that it's a respectable way to be anti-immigrant, to say, I'm for forests and trees and so on. And it's a nice way to sort of avoid being racist. There's no doubt, there's a man named John Tanton, who is the founder of an organization called FAIR, which is the most powerful anti-immigration lobby in Washington, who was a physician from Petrosky, Michigan, and who's been sort of at the head of this. He was in the Sierra Club at one time and so on, and kind of kicked out of the Sierra Club. He was kicked out of zero population growth, but he's really part of this very racist kind of anti-immigration movement, but which seeks respectability by hiding under the cover of environmentalism. And some of these people sort of invaded, in effect, the Sierra Club in the 1980s. They were kicked out of it. There were some elections within the Sierra Club over this. The board of the Sierra Club basically took a neutral position on immigration, and so some of these anti-immigration people then, hit back and are continuing to try, in effect, to take over the Sierra Club and use it as a weapon in this restrictionist lobbying war that is going on.
This city, for all of its diversity, remains very highly residentially segregated. And people may mix on the subway. There's no first-class car on the subway. Everybody's together on the subway in the morning, but people still live separately. Does that feed misunderstanding of immigrants? Does that feed anti-immigrant, suspicion of the other, suspicion of people who are not like us, whoever us happens to be?
Well, that's always been one of the factors that immigrants seem to be grouped together. And a lot of the factor has to do with the fact how they recruited to work. I mean, when the Chinese were first recruited, and still today, this whole subcontracting system, it will be better for your own ethnic group to manage you. So Chinese history has a long history of this. When America needs labor, we get them. But when we get them, we want the Chinese supervisor to supervise them. And we still go on today. For instance, the subcontractors, government subcontractors here, all these factories are run by Chinese. And so there is this segregation. The problem with that is not only that you work separately from somebody else, from the mainstream Americans, but you don't even get the chance to learn English. And that prolonged the problems of becoming part of American society.
Yeah, sometimes it's kind of a mixed bag, because sometimes immigrants want to be together also for cultural reasons. I mean, when the Irish first came, they were among the first Catholics to arrive, and the United States was a Protestant country, and so people wanted to have their own churches, and so a community, Jews did the same thing. I mean, it wasn't just that they wanted to be only with other Jews, but they needed kosher butchers, etc. They needed places where they could get the food they wanted. They needed synagogues, and so they tended to cluster in communities and recreate communities. So it's a mixed bag. I mean, but it doesn't always last forever. I mean, usually,
well, it's really
cases,
a generational phenomenon.
It's a generational phenomenon.
I was in Chicago, and I think that Chicago is a very segregated city, because you can see this is a neighborhood of Guatemalans, it's a neighborhood of Mexicans, it's an Italian neighborhood, and right now in New York City, I don't see that. I see that there are a lot of neighborhoods in which we have immigrants who are very new in the city, and they are very poor, and they are very crowded apartments. But I think people who are getting better living conditions, they are going to upstate New York maybe, but also in the center of Manhattan, where it's not possible to pay thousands of dollars for the rent. So I think New York City is becoming a very multicultural city now, because the new generations of immigrants are coming and they are living together. So we know Chinese people, Korean people, Mexicans, Ecuadorians, Africans. We're living in the same neighborhood.
Yeah, I think New York in that way is, I think, absolutely amazing. I mean, it's one of these things where, you know, it depends if you're an optimist or a pessimist. There is separation, but it's also, there is no other city in the entire world now which is as much of a world city. I mean, for the reasons you said before. I mean, look, there were practically no Mexicans in New York 15 years ago, and now there are at least 500,000, maybe 700,000, whatever. I mean, that's totally new. Asian New York, what you said before, I mean, and many different Asian groups. I mean, there is no other city anywhere in the world, Chicago, where I lived for a long time, is not as diverse. Los Angeles is maybe, but Los Angeles not quite, you know, but New York really has everybody.
Okay. I think the transportation system has something to do with it too. That New York's a walking city, New York suburb, people could communicate, congregate a lot more so than Los Angeles. Everybody is driving to different parts of the city.
One of the areas that I see daily, one of our offices in Woodside in Queens, which I had a visit from the Census Bureau very recently, who are working on a test program for the next census, and they chose a certain area which includes Woodside, Jackson Heights, those particular neighborhoods in Queens, and the last census reported that there are 140 different languages spoken in this particular area. Which is amazing to me, absolutely. And I think that that is a direct example of all of the different ethnicities that are living and coming to Queens, coming to maybe more of the suburb to come get the avail of the transportation into Manhattan for the jobs, for the work. And I think a generation or two later, you see the next example of progress where the suburbs become, I keep talking about the dream, but the suburbs become, if it's not Rockland or Westchester, seemingly for the Irish and Long Island, that's where they buy their own home with the picket fence, and that's where they've come to the full circle of why they came to this country.
My day job is, I work for George Arts Communication. One of our clients happens to be the Hunts Point produce market. And one of the things I found fascinating in getting to know this market is that you can trace immigration patterns by the product line.
That's right.
Because it's very raw capitalism. And all of a sudden all these Central American root vegetables were showing up. Kind of as you had this large Salvadoran, Nicaraguan influx, some degree Costa Rican influx. And also the Koreans are up there now, the Korean greengrocers are up there now. And, you know, part of, it's part of the wonder of this city.
Well, it reflects, Hunts Point is already progress. In other words, previously you're a vendor, and then you open a little grocery store. When you become rich enough, somehow you want to be the part of the distributor wholesaler.
Except that in the case of the Koreans, there's the self-helps, the benevolent associations where they actually fund other Koreans. It's almost a closed ethnic solidarity.
True, but they didn't start it that way. They started as a very humble grocery stores, and eventually there's so many of them, they are able to move vertically up.
But they also develop institutions that serve
exactly.
Many groups do that.
Yes,
take, for example, the revival of newsstands in New York. You know, 20 years ago there were no newsstands, certainly no newsstands in the subway, they were gone. And some South Asians started and made an offer, in effect, to the subway administration to start a couple of stands at a time when this was totally gone, you know. And and then some sociologists came along and said this would be a good thing because it would lower crime, because there'd be somebody in there and so forth, which turns out to be absolutely true. And but then they actually went into the business, in effect, of banking the development of newsstands. And so it's not by accident, just about every newsstand is South Asian.
Except that, and this actually applies to all three of the non-European, no, I shouldn't say non-European, of the everybody but the Belgian. I'm not
even think of myself as a Belgian. I never really was a national.
Having been in Belgium, I think it's a lovely country. the newsstands, because I was a newspaper reporter for a long time, I have some knowledge of it, there were a lot of charges that the people who worked in those newsstands, who were largely other South Asians, were being taken advantage of by the people who ran those places, much the way you see sweatshop issues, or you see in particular Mexicans, there are how many incidences of people dying and being seriously injured in very low-wage construction jobs, day laborers, and the Irish obviously have had that same experience. So this kind of ethnic solidarity that feeds
that's
an
two sides.
undocumented or a new immigrant also can oppress that new immigrant.
Exactly. That's two sides of the same coin. That is to say, a grouping together, you could help each other. On the other hand, you're the same people, you know the best how to exploit.
When you think of the garment, when there was a big garment industry in New York, I mean, it was run by Jewish capitalists, and the unions were Jewish. I mean, the workers were Jewish, and the bosses were Jewish. They hated each other, but they were all Jews from the same shtetl in.
No,
in
but the
Poland
issue is that because of the fear of immigration authorities and the fear of deportation, and because such a high percentage of immigrants in the city remain undocumented, even though there's no city in America that's as welcoming to people without questioning their documented status, I believe, and than New York is. It exposes them, it blocks them from seeking help, or at least it shouldn't, but it does. People fear seeking the kind of help that somebody who's a citizen or a legal resident might, at the drop of a hat, go and seek.
Well, that's the
where
problem.
Tepeyac comes in.
Well, I mean, in particular, Tepeyac.
In particular, Tepeyac, yes.
But that's the problem of your law, not the problem of the community. In other words, if you don't provide protection, right, then, in other words, it's in all the immigrant community. When the law enforcement have no incentive to enforce law in those community, then the people within those community take laws into themselves. And so this is the way with the Italians, this is the way with the Chinese, this is the way with many, many other immigrant communities. So I think that's the institutional issues rather than necessarily the community issue.
I think the situation in New York City is becoming amazing with all these cultures together. But the problem is we are sharing the same space at the school, we're sharing the same space at the church, at the neighborhood, at the work. But the problem is we're not working together yet. We are just working in our own business and working in our own organization, but we're not yet working together. And we're not changing the law. We're not changing the regulations of the city. Even if we are more and more new immigrants here, we're not changing any new regulation. I was in Tepeyac trying to get a space in Central Park and also on the street of New York for one of our activities, cultural activities, and they say, I went to the court and they say, sorry, but you cannot change the regulation of the city of New York. Mm-hmm. Even if you are 1 million people, because you didn't come before this year, you are not able to change the regulation of the city. So I think we have to work together for a new generation of immigrants, a new generation of New Yorkers. And we're not working together to get legalization of immigrants. We're working together to change the minimum salary. Everybody knows that the minimum salary in other states are bigger than New York City.
Well, that debate is going on in Albany right now. There's also a case of discrimination. I'm not using that in a racist sense, but a kind of in a technical sense of distinguishing among nations that are sending us immigrants, among immigrant groups, in how they are welcomed, how they get access to visas. The Irish got the Morrison visas, which was a kind of a separate group of visas, which in some sense was acknowledging the reality that all these people were here. I lived in Miami for a while, where you saw this dramatic difference between the way Cubans were treated under the law and the way Haitians were treated under the law, where the Cubans were welcomed in, the Haitians were not. Obviously one of the immediate responses to the unrest in Haiti and the ouster of President Aristide was, the first thing out of President Bush's mouth was, we're going to stop immigrants on the open water,
right.
Coming to this country, when arguably since one of the arguments is, are a lot of immigrants economic refugees or are they political refugees? If those aren't political refugees, I don't know who is. But I mean, how does this, these immigration issues get filtered through the crazy quilt of American politics?
Well,
Who wants to touch that one?
In the United States,
The Chinese, the Chinese Exclusion Act is the most dramatic negative example.
But 1965 is the most liberal democratic immigration law that we have. And that is to say, people not, you could
Except
pick
that
on
it
it, but
imposed for the first time
Right.
a limit on Latin American immigration, which did not exist before.
But in the sense, however, every country has equal quota, and led to, subsequently, we have pretty much a multiracial society. Now, the problem is, just like the civil rights movement, we have been trying to, quote unquote, correct that 1965 Immigration Act, and what we are doing actually is trying to cut down the number of, quote unquote, family-based immigration, because we believe a lot of the people who are eligible to come to the United States, they're from poor, uneducated places. So the law has been gradually moving that direction, and the income level of many immigrant groups is reflecting. The income group is higher and more professional, and at the same time, you have the other thing going on, which is trying to say, okay, even though we want to limit the number of poor immigrants to become naturalized, but we still need them. But how about make them guest workers? And I think this is what the discussion is about, that how do we make these poor, uneducated workers, right, come, and we could get rid of them when we don't need them.
Well, it's the second half of that. We can get rid of them when we don't need them, which enters into the much more destructive aspect. Like, again, living in Florida, where there were a lot of Jamaican, what they called H2 workers, brought in to work the sugar fields, provided that they would kick them out as soon as the harvest, as soon as the harvest was over. And so, again, but what about the selective nature of immigration?
Well, first of all, I really think that I've looked at these guest worker programs historically. And, of course, there was a huge guest worker program involving Mexicans. I mean, people don't realize. It started in World War I, actually. Sure. I mean, you were talking about Chicago before. The neighborhoods in Chicago, Mexicans began to go to Chicago in World War I to run railroad yards and so on, and because of the Illinois Central going straight up. So working in the steel mills and so forth during the war. And then this was revived in World War II and again in the Korean War. And these were all guest worker programs, all supposedly involving people who would be here for a short period of time and then go back. But most did not go back. Or if they did, they went back and then came back again and so on. So we know from experience that guest worker programs, even when they are strict and when they are indeed, as Peter said, meant to keep people out and prevent them from becoming citizens, in fact, don't really work that way. And some of the restrictionists are against guest worker programs because for those reasons. So people like FAIR, for example, these anti-immigration groups, are against guest worker programs not because they want to protect American workers or because they want to be nice to immigrants, but because they believe that these programs, in fact, lead to actual immigration, and they have, in fact.
Well, one of the great strengths in this city, I believe, starting with officially with the 1990 census, and remember, when you're talking about undocumented immigrants, you're talking about people who are vastly undercounted in the census. In 1990, for the first time, non-Hispanic whites were a minority of the city. They were like 40-something%, and at this point, they're less than 40% of the population of the city, so we're all minorities. And, it's almost as if the terminology of majority and minority is insufficient. But within the Latino community in particular, traditionally, for instance, Puerto Ricans made up 80-90% of the Latino community up to 1970, let's say, and as even up to 1980. And with beginning with the huge Dominican influx, and now with Mexicans, and Colombians, Nicaraguans, Salvadorans, obviously, the biggest difference there is that immigration became an issue. Puerto Ricans are citizens. They can just hop on a plane and come here. So it's an example of how demographics demographic shifts changes the politics of a community or changes the politics of a city.
But we also have to take into consideration the way we draw these lines. You keep referring, I mean, you keep using these terms, sort of white, Hispanic, and so on, but those are very arbitrary categories. And as you know, for the first time, the census, the 2000 census, tried to get out of these by enabling people, for the first time in American history, to check more than one category. And many of us are more than one category. There's a lot of intermarriage between Asians and non-Asians, between Hispanics and non-Hispanics. So the idea of somehow categorizing people, you know, within these categories simply doesn't make sense anymore. Most people don't fit.
I think the Mexicans have the example about that, and maybe the Chinese too, because we are categorized in the Hispanic community, but we have Hispanics are those who speak Spanish in some ways, but we have Mexicans who don't speak Spanish. So we have 7 ethnic groups who are Mexicans, but they don't speak Spanish. So why we're Hispanics?
I'm going to go to questions. Tell us your name and what the campus you're from, and speak up, please.
Okay. My name is Monique Haynes, and I attend York College. Increasingly in the media, we're seeing cases of immigrant exploitation, especially like Mexican groups. They come here and they have very low-paying jobs, and they live in substandard homes. My question to the panel tonight is, what are the people in power doing to diminish this exploitation and to help these people live the improved lives that they actually come here for?
Or are they?
Excuse me?
Or are they trying to improve it?
They
or
are trying to
does that
improve their
situation serve an economic interest?
Yes. What are the people in power doing?
Yeah, I think one of the most important issue involved here is that there's an immigration issue, there's a labor issue. And what happened is that if you're illegal, so somehow in the law does not protect you. And the illegality actually make violation, exploitation, undetectable. In other words, if I'm illegal, I'm exploited, I can't go to somebody who says, look, you can do something about it. So I think in America, ambiguity between this immigration and labor enforcement is really causing this kind of problems to continue. And many of us have always been promoting the fact that make labor law stand alone. If an illegal or legal or white or black, whatever person come and say, look, my rights being abused, and the labor authority ought to address to that, rather than try to question whether you're legal or not legal. By questioning legal or not legal, actually forcing these immigrants not come forward and make that kind of exploitation even more entrenched.
But I thought American labor unions had in fact moved in that direction in recent years. I mean, Unite took on illegal workers as union members some years ago, and I thought that AFL-CIO at its last Congress, I thought, had begun to move in that direction, really viewing workers as workers regardless of their status. I mean, Tepeyac has been very involved in that.
I think basically the AFL-CIO right now, they need more workers who can be members.
To stay in business.
They need more members. Right. And they know that right now they have 40% of their membership are undocumented immigrants. I don't like to call them illegal. No. They are undocumented because they don't have documents. They're not doing anything illegally. And recently the bill of McCain says that 90% of the new immigrants in the United States are not delinquents, that they are not doing anything illegally. So
in fact, they are not tapping into welfare. They are not tapping into a lot of the things that you have, a lot of the broad brush.
Talking about the question, I think what the government is doing now, I think the government is not doing anything. They're just keeping the undocumented immigrants undocumented because it's better for the business, it's better for the economy to have undocumented immigrants, cheap laborers. And you know that everybody who wants to work, they have to go to buy a green card or social security number, false social security, and then you can go and get a job. And the employer has to say You have documents, and you have to say yes, but no more questions, because they know already that they are undocumented immigrants, and they are bringing the false social security and false green card.
Irish are not immune from this kind of an experience.
Not at all. And in fact, one of the things that I was going to say about any immigrant community being treated in any kind of way like this, be it from a labor or a landlord, there's a fear of coming forward because of the status, and if there's a fear of authority, and there's a fear of being misinterpreted, and this is rampant amongst immigrants. I can remember I was undocumented for a while, and you lead a very, very different life on the other side of that world. And it is an issue, but what to do about it?
It's you remind us that it's much easier for Europeans to come in as undocumented because they don't need visas.
That's right.
There are nearly 30
Overstay.
countries, basically rich countries, do not need visas, and so you come in as a tourist, basically. You do not need a visa, you just come in with your passport, Irish or Belgian or Dutch or French or whatever, and then you can hang around and you just stay beyond. Those are called overstayers, technically. But they're overstayers, and you go into any bar in New York, and I would say that 80% of the people, especially women who work behind the bars and who speak with a nice European accent, are overstayers who are gotten a job.
Let me go to another question.
Hi, my name is April Dallin. I'm from Hunter College, and I have a question about male immigrants that come over to work and they leave behind families and children and they send back money. I know a lot of people that do that. Do you think the destruction of family or the separation of family has an effect on not only the destruction of community sense in New York City, but in the other country? And does that keep workers or it's sort of low level because of the lack of support, from
But yet people who make very little money,
community.
from our perspective, are able to send what's a very significant amount of money to the home country. It's a very good question. Anybody want to jump on that?
I think most of the immigrants are working for two economies. The economy in the United States, and they are doing their best, but they also are, I can say, they are putting their best work to do for the economy of their own countries. And in Mexico, this is the second amount of money that we have coming from all over the world. And so we have the oil, big business in Mexico is the oil, and then the money coming from the immigrants.
Right.
So basically the immigrants in the United States are maintaining the economy in Mexico. So I think it's amazing to see how $5, $50, which are trying to get in the United States, most of the immigrants is doing changes in the different small businesses, small towns, and the families. I think money coming from immigrants to our countries is changing churches, libraries, hospitals, schools, streets. They are moving the new city from the old cities to new cities now, because in the past the government was not doing anything. Now immigrants are changing the cities.
I think there's another point to this. That is, I think it's a very important point that immigrants generally, male or female, come first, one individual, and then you have a chain migration. I mean, that's a very natural order, particularly if this is a good place and people say, come. Now, in the past, there are all these different kind of laws restricting that possibility. For instance, in the case of Chinese Exclusion Act, you can't bring your family, even you're here. Then the 1924 National Origins Act tried to restrict certain kind of, even the Europeans, from coming to do so. So that's the good part of the 1965 Immigration Act. Majority of the quota is tried to help the family, American citizens bring their family.
Family unification. Yes, sir.
Yes, good evening, distinguished panelists. My name is Robinson Diaz from York College. I would like to make a comment and then a question.
Briefly.
Yes, sure. From 1841 to 1930, over 29 million people migrated to the United States. I was going to mention the National Origin Act, which actually was one of the first forms in the ways of holding back immigrants from the United States. But my question is, you guys spoke about social, environmental, contracting, and some financial aspect of immigration. I didn't hear you guys actually touch something that really affects families, which is when an illegal immigrant comes to the United States and he happens to get caught, or he happens to get pulled over by a police officer, and then they find out that he's illegal, and he gets put through a criminal system and is held there for months and sometimes even years. I didn't hear you guys refer to any of these things. Can you guys give us a little
And then,
brief,
if I'm
description
correct,
of
and
these?
then automatically deported at the end of that sentence.
Yes, that I understand that, but I'm saying is there anything that is being done to actually look at the legal technicalities of sometimes the sentencing for some of these individuals? Because sometimes there might be even a traffic infraction. You get caught up and you got to do a few months in prison just for a traffic infraction before they send you to back home. Is there anything being done to address that?
But earlier I used the word illegal immigration, illegal immigrants. You objected to it. And I think it's very important. I want to use the word illegal immigration because that's exactly what the law wants to do. They want to classify two different kind of people, legal and illegal. If you're illegal, you don't have these protections. That's exactly what happens. So the issue here seems to me on the dealing with legal part, there's not much can be done. But I think it's got to be some changing our attitude towards this whole concept. If people coming in and doing jobs that American industry wants, they should become legal. And that, and in the case of United States earlier history, we tend to believe, there's a period, tend to believe that if we want you ought to be able to become citizen, naturalized. And I think that ultimately the question is, how do we address those issues? We need these people. They are coming here productively, and therefore we should do so. Instead of wanting them, but give them no legality and prosecute them. But that's exactly why this kind of exploitation could continue to go on.
Go ahead, briefly.
In Tepeyac, we have two permanent campaigns. One is we have to work to legalize everybody. We have to get the permanent residency for everybody, not only for our community. But we also have to give information to everybody. If immigrants are informed about the system and how we can go away from the system and not being in the prison very soon, I think we can keep people working and doing their best, and they never go to see the police. So they have to get photo ID, they have to get different documents, whatever, and to keep these people out of the prison.
Let me go to another question, please.
Hi, my name is Anna Alvarez. I'm from City College, and several of the panelists, you guys mentioned on how there are many families here who have been illegal for about 5, 10, 15 years, and where they have family and where their children are actual American citizens, and in situations they've been forced to leave their country of where they themselves consider themselves American, but the fact that their parents are illegal, they're forced to leave the country. I was wondering if there was anything that had been raised in issues and what rights these children would have to say, I have the right to stay in this country.
Well, the children do have the right to stay, but their parents don't. And part of the people who are the restrictionists, I think was the term you used, argue that some people, try to get to America to have their baby in America just so that that child will in fact be an American. My take is, I happen to believe that it's not easy to get to this country from a lot of places where immigrants are coming from. And if you're resourceful enough to get here, we probably want you because you're bringing us some talents and some skills and some resourcefulness that I think we can probably use. Anybody? I mean,
well, I
the
think one has to be look. We all basically sympathize with the situation, but one has to also look at it realistically. I mean, there is a special relationship, and there has been a special relationship now for over a century between the United States and Mexico. I mean, Mexico is not China, and it's not Belgium, and it's not Ireland. You know, it's next door. It's right there. And so the relationship between Mexico and the United States has been very special for a very long time. And it is relatively easy. I know there is a risk involved, but of course there's always a risk involved, but it is relatively easy to get from Mexico to the US, easier than it is for just about anywhere else except Canada, which nobody ever talks about. But it happens there too. But seriously, I mean, so Mexico, the Mexican-US relationship has really been very special. And it's very difficult, in effect, by any standards, to maintain a boundary between the two countries. I mean, it's physically difficult, and it's legally difficult. It would require the United States, I mean, because, for example, there's a piece in today's paper again about the plan to build a better fence. But, you know, to build a Berlin Wall along the southern border, many American businessmen don't want that. And many Americans who are not necessarily lovers of Mexico don't want to have this wall there. I mean, there's something special about it, and so some other arrangement has to be, you know...
Well, but there's a moral question and there's a legal question. I mean, the moral question, if you will, which gets played out legally, is those South Texas businessmen, for instance, who want the Mexicans to come over and work, don't want them to live near them. And can you have it, you know, can you have it both ways?
Much of the population of the Southwest is now Mexican-American, is the point. I mean, communities really are mixed. And even though it's true there are a lot of white Texans who don't want it, look at President Bush when he was governor of Texas. I mean, he, after all, did campaign to try to get the Mexican-American vote. He only got about a third of it, but that's a lot when you think of it.
Try to get some more questions in.
Hi, my name is Osman Bedrettin Osman, and I'm from the College of Staten Island, and I have two questions for the panel. Now, my first question is, where would these new immigrants are expected to work? What kind of jobs? The jobs are leaving the United States, the factory jobs, so where are they supposed to work? And the second question I have is this issue of immigration, is it just to get people who do not vote to bring them to the panel and vote for the president who's bringing this idea? Or is this really, is it going to be really taken care of?
Who wants to jump on that?
I'll talk about the work,
Go ahead.
maybe part of it to begin with. The people that are here in undocumented status right now are already working. And the argument can be made, I mean, particularly in our community, people who are here are doing jobs that per se are not in high demand, that there aren't people lining up for who are American citizens and who have the benefits in this country, you know, are not lining up at 6 o'clock on a snowy morning to do the construction work that is being offered by the different construction companies. It's a cash business. A lot of the work that's on offer may be in areas where there isn't a lot of bookkeeping, shall we say. Child minding, for example, is a huge area where, you know, a Jamaican woman, an Irish woman, are filling a need that there is, especially in the economy of today, when for most situations both parents work. You need childcare. So in that aspect, I don't see exactly, I mean, there's a niche being filled right now in terms of the work that is available, and that's what we constantly have to keep looking forward to.
And the point you make, I think, is very important in relation to that question, namely, some of those jobs cannot be exported. You export factory jobs, or even now many jobs, let's say, to Asia and so on, but child minding, cleaning, construction, all those, notice, they all have in common the fact that they are localized. I mean, you can't export your babysitter job. I mean, that has to be done right here. So there is a nature to a characteristic to a lot of these jobs. They're all jobs that really require service performance right here, and that is one of the very characteristic types of jobs.
Yes, sir.
That gets filled.
Hi, my name is Edwin Suarez. I'm from York College, and my question to the panel is very simple. What are we doing with all this economic power that we have? I grew up in Brooklyn, and
That's off the mainland of the United States, by the way.
that's correct, sir. It's
I did too.
Kings County. The students that I went to school with were immigrants, but they were different. They were Polish, German, different people back in those days. I don't want to give away my age. Now my children are going to school with kids from Asia, South Asia, Dominican, different parts. As it's changed, there is a certain economic power that we have. We work here, we spend our money here, some of it goes back. Why don't we learn from our past mistakes and put all this power together and also get people to vote and register us,
Right now, the Tepeyac Association has a campaign and inviting other organizations to encourage the congressmen and senators to change the law, the immigration law. So all citizens, all immigrants who were undocumented, all children of immigrants can sign and give us their signature to push the congressmen and senators to legalize undocumented immigrants now. And this is one of the things that we can do. And the power of the people is always, if we get together in one goal or two different goals to change the law, that will be a big power.
Well, in that issue you're talking about, there are two things. One is that all these immigrants are really new. For instance, Asian immigration double every 10 years. So you're really talking about a lot of very, very recent immigrants. Their experience, their knowledge about American politics is limited. At this present time, their participation is going to be not as strong. That's number one. Number two, if you look at all these immigrant groups, when you talk about Latinos, you talk about Asians, you're talking about all kinds of different groups. For instance, Asian groups, you're talking about dozens of different coming from different places, and you have different classes, different education. I mean, Chinese community is very, very much split. There's one group that is high-tech, very well educated, and you have sweatshop people. So that's another problem of organizing, because we don't necessarily have a common agenda.
Let me get one more question in, please.
Jonathan Kimmel from Brooklyn College.
Speak up.
I wanted to know about, specifically after the last pro-immigration march that we had in New York, the next couple days later, there was mass arrests going on at Walmart, which is the single largest employer in the United States. I wanted to know if that was an issue to say we have jobs there that other people can be working in, lots of people, rather than having illegal immigrants, we can have people in the United States. And that doesn't appear to be a demeaning job.
All right, I mean, the issue of jobs and the availability of jobs and whether they're taking jobs from American citizens is really what it is.
Well, that's been on the agenda in one way or another for a very long time. And starting in the 1950s, American labor, organized labor, demanded the enactment of laws that prohibited the hiring of undocumented workers, because they felt that they could not organize unions so long as employers had the possibility of doing this. And this was viewed as a progressive thing for a long, long time, to try to get such a law on the books. And of course, it didn't get on the books because the Republican Party didn't want it, the Southern Democrats didn't want it, etc. It finally got on the books in 1986 as part of a package of a two-piece package. One was amnesty for a very large number of people, roughly 3 million people, of which 60% or so were Mexican, and the imposition for the first time of this law which imposed fines on employers of undocumented workers. Well, number one, the law was not enforced, And number two, and one has to be straightforward about it, there was really mixed feelings. A number of the Mexican organization, MALDEF, for example, argued that this law led to discrimination because employers, you know, if somebody came in and looked Irish or Polish or whatever, they didn't ask questions. But if somebody looked Mexican, then they would start checking up on it. So even some of the progressive groups took a stand against it. Senator Kennedy ended up being against the law, even though he had been for it before. So it's a kind of mixed bag, and I think one has to understand that in this whole immigration system, it's very difficult sometimes to know exactly what is progressive and what is reactionary. It's not an easy thing to sort out.
We only have a couple of minutes left. Let me ask you each for about a 30-second look forward. We do have a cyclical nature of anti-immigrant feeling and a more welcoming feeling. I mean, and we're in an economic recession, which tends to raise anti-immigrant feeling. I mean, are you optimistic about the near future?
Well, I think with the jobs that's leaving and American economy is not in good shape, I think immigrant bashing is going to be surfacing again just regularly in American history.
I think immigrants are creating new jobs for a new economy in the United States, and I see that there is a lot of hope for immigrants who are here, but also I think the new immigrants are becoming a solution for the United States.
I'd say I'd have to be cautiously optimistic that some of the trends that we have seen, even with some of the outsourcing going on, may help us in the future with regard to immigration. That there may be some talents that a certain country has that can be brought in, and that work may come from that.
Briefly. Yeah, and again, I think immigration politics makes for strange bedfellows. I mean, the people who are for immigration are, on the one hand, the immigrants themselves and the organizations like Tepeyac and others which defend immigrant rights and so forth, and yours. And on the other hand, some very conservative, pro-business, free enterprise, etc.
Cheap labor.
Who want it for cheap labor. And against it, you have racists, whom I mentioned, the FAIR organization and so on, some of the people who get involved in these things, and sometimes some progressives on the left who see, an organized labor. So it's a mixed bag, and it makes for very difficult
It's time to say goodbye. I mean, my people who came in 1905 to 1915 probably wouldn't be let in today, and that always instructs me, and I do believe that people who are resourceful enough to get here have a lot to offer for us. I want to thank you all, and we'll see you next time on the CUNY Forum.
Thank you.